Perfect. Yeah, he reached out to me yesterday afternoon saying if we want those ASAP, we should let him know as soon as possible.
Yeah, and then what's the turnaround on the t-shirts?
Depending how.
The San Joaquin Valley Urban Forest Council. As you can see from the agenda, we're going to start with welcome and setup, and then we're going to go straight into our core presentation, co-presented by two people with a wealth of knowledge about our urban forests. Immediately following that presentation, we'll have an update from our CAL FIRE San Joaquin Regional Urban Forester, and also a brief historical perspective of the work of my organization, Tree Fresno. If we have time, I'll conclude our meeting with a general update of present day Tree Fresno, and then it'll be a wrap. So a little bit of background. There are 7 councils throughout the state under the umbrella of the California Urban Forest Council. My role is that of San Joaquin Valley Regional Representative of the California Urban Forest Council, which was founded in 1968 as the first urban forest council in the nation. The council is a group of stakeholders in urban forestry throughout the state, private and public sectors, nonprofits, a lot of public agencies. Specifically in the San Joaquin Valley, this network targets the urban forests, which connect and improve quality of life throughout our communities. We envision thriving and prosperous California communities transformed by healthy trees and green spaces. We advance smart investment in green infrastructure through education and outreach, community-based activities, and collaborative action. In fact, the core presentation today, co-presented by the City of Fresno and West Coast Arborists, thank you, is designed to provide information to be used throughout the region in the interest of managing risk to promote a safe and healthy urban forest. The first presenter is Tim Crothers, who is the Plant Health Care Manager for West Coast Arborists, Inc. in Anaheim, where he supervises data collection, plant health care treatments, consulting arborist work, as well as writing urban forest management plans. He has a Bachelor's of Science degree in Environmental Horticulture Science from Cal Poly and specialized in landscape design. He is an ISA board certified master arborist with utility and municipal specialties, as well as a tree risk assessment qualification. In 2020, he became a registered consulting arborist with the American Society of Arboriculture. He also holds a qualified applicator license with the California Department of Pesticide Regulation. He has over 20 years of experience in the landscape construction, landscape maintenance, and arboriculture fields, primarily in project management roles. Our second presenter is going to be Scott Mosier, who's been with the City of Fresno since 2002 and brings over 28 years of public and private sector service to his leadership role with the city. He currently serves as Public Works Director for a department with more than 350 employees and a $200 million budget. Scott oversees construction management, engineering services, project management, street maintenance, landscape and park maintenance, facilities, traffic operations, and planning, and is heavily involved in numerous private development projects and plays a critical role in major projects such as neighborhood reconstruction, parks, new police and fire facilities, Veterans Boulevard, and high-speed rail grade separation. He has responsibility for the maintenance of community facilities, district landscapes, parks, trails, and the urban forest. Prior to joining City of Fresno, Scott spent several years with private engineering firms in Los Angeles and the Bay Area, managing the design of numerous projects, including freeway interchanges, street improvements, light rail system construction. He is licensed in the state of California as both a civil and traffic engineer. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about today's program before we start. It is brought to us by the California Urban Forest Council, who received a grant from our friends at CAL FIRE called the City Forest Renewal Program. And within that, there are deliverables, which include removing hazardous trees from cities, working with cities to enhance their urban forest policies and modifying them, and also educating the public. Part of that education is what Tim and Scott are about to share with us. We're trying to educate the public and stakeholders about how to manage forests appropriately by using some of the best management practices out there. So that's the spirit of this. In the interest of full disclosure, each regional council like ours receives $1,000 to put towards the work of convening the webinar. I'd also like to mention that after the webinar, and this is important, there will be an email that is shared with attendees interested in receiving CEUs. There will be an informational slide at the end of the webinar, which includes contact information. Those who've communicated with me directly will automatically receive a follow-up email. Now we're just about to hand the mic over to Tim Crothers, but before we do that, I'd like to review the webinar outcomes. What are we learning today? Aid public, what do we want to accomplish today? Our outcomes include aid public agency arborists with ways to improve their urban forest program, improve risk management techniques being used by public agencies, encourage comprehensive management activities to reduce long-term risks, and to leverage the benefits of your urban forest to maintain proper funding. These are the ideal webinar outcomes from today's program. And finally, before we plunge into the program, what are the benefits of proactive management approach? Reducing tree risk is a great starting point to better urban forest management. We want to find an efficient work approach, easy to track work history, reduce risk, reduce number of tree failures, reduce infrastructure conflicts. And when you do all that, you're going to reduce costs and maximize those tree benefits. If you have questions related to the presentation, please type them into the text box and we will try to attend to them. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Tim Crothers from West Coast Arborist. Take it away, Tim.
All right, thanks very much. It's a great introduction and great summary of what we're going to be talking about today. And thanks everybody for joining. I recognize some of the names on the attendee list, so I'm sure you're out there and I'm glad to see that you're joining us. So there's my contact information there, or my certifications, as Mona mentioned right there. So yeah, board certified master arborist, tree risk assessment qualification. That's quite a bit of what I do here at West Coast Arborists in supervising the plant healthcare technicians, the consulting arborists that write reports, the inventory specialists that are doing the data collection out there in the field. So pretty much all the non-chainsaw work is what I supervise here at West Coast. So let's go right into the presentation. All right, so you'll see a first slide here. So before you can even discuss, talking about managing risk in trees in your urban forest, you have to know what you have. Because if you don't know what you have, then how are you going to approach your management of them, right? So you have to have a tree inventory. So what is a tree inventory for those that maybe are not familiar with or just learning? So it's basically a record of the location, characteristics. It's an assessment of trees within a defined group. So we're going to be talking about grid trimming later, or regular pruning cycles and stuff. So that's where this kind of fits in, is knowing what you have in the inventory, managing the risk, which I'll discuss, and then Scott will talk about how you actually put that program into place. So you're changing your operation from reactive to proactive by having a tree inventory and having a regular cycle which you go through the city. That's going to increase your efficiency because you're touching, or at least looking and inspecting trees on a regular basis. You're able to document your actions because you'll have that work history. And you can justify your budgets going forward. If you know how many trees you have, then you can confidently go to council as necessary and say, hey, this is how many trees I have. These are the removals I have. These are the special trims. And you can better justify your budgets. Go to the next slide. So what makes a useful inventory? Basically, you have that information at your fingertips. So you've got the location of where that tree is physically residing, whether it be on a main street like you see in the diagram there, or a sub-street. Is it on the side of the house or the front of the house? Is it in a park? Any of those type of locations. The slope, you're going to capture that information in the inventory, and then you can start making decisions. So these are some of the typical attributes that you collect in a inventory. You got your size of the trunk, you've got your height of the tree, the condition that the tree is in, its recommended maintenance, and you can specifically put that particular tree or those streets into districts and then start building lists from there and managing your forest. So the importance of an up-to-date GPS inventory. So obviously trees are growing. They're growing and they're changing over time. They're experiencing wind loads, they're experiencing storms, they're experiencing public works improvement projects, any number of things are going on to the tree, right? But at that point in time, when the data collector or the inventory specialist goes and sees the tree and collects that information, that's just a snapshot in time, as you can see on the right-hand side there. So the inventory itself needs to change as well. So you have to look at your inventory on a regular basis, and quite a few cities will, update their inventory through their grid trimming cycle as they're going and trimming those trees every 4, 5, 6, 7 years. It's receiving another inspection by the crew that's performing the work on the tree. So that's a minimum step, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later too. But it's good to look at the trees in between those cycles as well. So the industry standard is basically recommending the trees be inspected every 4 years. So if your grid cycle is longer than that, you need to be looking at those trees with another pair of eyes in that time frame. And we'll see as we go through the presentation why that's important. Next slide. So updating the inventory itself. So update the inventory regularly so you got the most current information available to you to make your management decisions. Capture the data with images as when possible. So some of the devices that they'll use out in the field, like a Trimble, you're not gonna be able to capture a picture of the tree, but with mobile application, you can capture the tree picture and store that in your inventory system so you can look at the tree's condition over time. You can store reports in your inventory. You can review that data regularly based on your goals and guidelines or whatever the policies or the ordinances say in your particular agency. And then utilize that data to plan your work and set your budgets. So before we start getting into the real meat of the managing the risk, let's talk about a case study here. So you've got, got a coast live oak here that's on a slope right next to a city tree or a city street. And the situation is that the resident applied to, perform some renovation in their front yard. They built those retaining walls. The city said, yes, you can go ahead and do it, but didn't consider what the effects will be on the tree. So it's a city tree, and your job as a manager of the street trees or the urban forest is to decide what's wrong with the tree now and what are you going to do about it. So you can see in the pictures there that the tree is clearly starting to thin. Those are some coast live oaks behind it and stuff. Those are the same age, same size, and they look green. And this one is clearly struggling. You can see a lot of sky through the branches, right? So what would you do? You've got mitigation that needs to happen. So would you require that the contractor remove the tree and replant the new tree because it looks nearly dead? Would you potentially wait and see what's going on with it and maybe it'll come back to good health? Would you perform a tree risk assessment? That's something that we'll talk about in the presentation. Perhaps you take some lab samples to find out what's going on with the foliage. Is there a fungus? Is there a pest? Is there nutrients deficient? What's going on? Or maybe you do both C and D. We're not going to do a poll, but it's just something to think about. You got different options to take care of trees and manage risk, right? So let's look at the next slide. That's the same tree. You can see the landscaping is actually filled in. In this case, I was the actual area manager for that city and managing these trees as part of West Coast Arborists. And we monitored the tree after a while, and we asked that the city contact the contractor and see what they can do to install some more irrigation and some fertilizer to the tree. And lo and behold, the tree came back. So it maybe went into shock when it lost some roots in the construction process, but the tree did come back, and there was no pruning done on the tree. We just left what growth it had on there, and it was able to recover. So that's a win-win situation. So let's talk about tree risk now. So what is tree risk? It's the combination of the likelihood of a conflict or tree failure occurring and affecting a target and the severity of the associated consequences. So in the background, you can kind of see the image there. You've got a sycamore tree that's got a considerable lean to it. I'll go back to the same slide, previous slide. There you go. So the sycamore tree there, you can kind of see it's leaning. Then it branches into a kind of co-dominant scaffold limbs. The lean is towards the power lines and utility lines. It's leaning over a street where people park their cars. So you're saying, okay, what is the likelihood of conflict here? Probably pretty likely that if something fell, it's going to land on those lines or land in the street, potentially on a car, right? So what would be the consequences? So those are the factors that go into your decision-making process and the assessment of risk. We'll discuss the different levels here too. Let's go to the next slide. So some people might be kind of confused about risk versus hazard, right? They sound very similar in terms. So let's talk about hazards for a moment. So what is a hazard and how is it different from risk? So a hazard would be a situation of a condition in a tree. Oh, go back to the previous slide. That is likely to lead to loss, personal injury, or property damage. The disruption of activities. So it's basically a likely source of harm. So in terms of arboriculture, the hazard would be the tree part identified as a likely source of harm. In the upper picture there, you can see it's a Chinese elm, and there's a branch pruned as part of that operation. And then right above it, there's a pretty significant bend from a branch, which is not untypical in Chinese elms, but there does appear to be a crack forming right above where that one branch is pruned. You can see the pruning cut and the branch that is going off to the left-hand side there. And then down below, you can see on a blue gum eucalyptus, some latiparus, sulfur fungus going on the tree. So those would be the hazards, the crack itself, right? Or the fungus that's in the tree. Now, how are we going to assess risk from those particular hazards that might fall on a tree, fall in the street or fall on somebody? Let's look at the next slide. So what would the risk factors be to consider as you're assessing the risk itself? So you want to look at the targets. Are they protected in some way? Is there, if something fell from the tree, is it going to land on something before it lands on the target that you're considering? What's the zone, the occupancy by people or people around it constantly because it's a major walkway into a building? Or is it a median tree and it's right next to a left-hand turn lane where cars will sit, periodically for a couple minutes while they wait for a green light, right? So what's the occupancy level underneath the tree? The site itself, has there been, or the tree itself, has there been previous failures that you need to consider on the tree? If it's unbalanced, has it broken before and it's likely to break again? What are the weather conditions to consider? The soil weakness, is it growing in rocky soil where, if it may be more likely to withstand wind loading, or if it's weak soil, or the tree itself, its health, vigor, has it been affected by pests, the different loads it might experience, the defects in the tree, like you can see in the picture right here, a ficus tree that was topped at some point and then started to regrow new branches to get a new canopy going. So all those branches are weakly attached to that point where it was topped, right? So you got structural defects. Those are all things to consider when you're assessing the risk. So you're at the site, right? You're going to perform an assessment on the tree. That's considered an inspection. You're actually inspecting the tree at this point. So what are the goals while you're inspecting the tree? You need to gather information on the tree health, its condition, its structure. You need to document the items of concern for follow-up if necessary by someone else in the agency or a third party. Identify hazards before they cause harm. And identify trends or consistent challenges that you're seeing within your agency. Is it a certain species of tree that you're always noticing that get quite a few failures from, right? These images right here, you can see these are of a Aleppo pine that I took on a golf course. And I went to visit this tree the first time. That's the upper picture right there. And I could see that tree had a major failure. It had included bark. You can actually see the bark from the rest of the branches right there, and the rest of the tree broke off. My second visit to the same tree is this lower photo, and just a couple days before, the rest of that branch kind of broke off, which you can kind of see there in the lower portion. So I told them, considered removing this tree. They didn't do it fast enough and it continued to break, right? Fortunately, it didn't land on anyone or anything. Let's go to the next slide. So you've done your inspection. So you need to consider, are there any routine inspection cycles in place too? So you got, inspections may or may not be risk assessments. It could involve that or it could not. It really depends on the assignment. It also depends on your qualifications. As much as we'd like there to be a one-size-fits-all answer to routine inspections, there really isn't, because every urban forest is different. Every city is different because they've got different policies, ordinances in place. So there really isn't a one-size-fits-all. So you have to really customize what your inspection cycle is going to be. Is every inspection going to be a risk assessment? That's a tall order, right? Or is it going to be inspection and then let that inspection determine if somebody else needs to do a risk assessment on the tree. Next slide. So here are some of the things to consider when you're doing routine inspections. Which trees should be inspected would be a question to ask yourself. How often are they inspected? How many inspections do your resources allow for? You got to know your budget, right? You're going to be spending some of your money on maintaining the trees themselves. How much money do you have left over to doing inspections or risk assessments? Are the inspectors qualified to perform the inspection? What is their experience level? Have they dealt enough with trees to be able to make decisions that you need them to make? Are there management plans, policies, ordinances, manuals, and guidelines that already say what you're supposed to do? So instead of trying to make it up on your own, just look at those documents. It might already say in there what you're supposed to be doing. And then how is that inspection documented? Is it filled out on a piece of paper and somebody stores it in a cabinet, or is it digitally saved somehow? And if so, where is it stored? These are all things that you need to consider as you're setting up an inspection program. So the inspected items should include, but are not limited to, lean root problems like we've already seen in some of these pictures, codominant, multiple trunks, trunk cavities, cankers, mushrooms, decay, cracks in trunks, branches, weakly attached scaffold limbs and branches. These are all very common things that you can see in trees without too much training or experience. If you see something that doesn't look right in the tree, such as dead branches, maybe some pests or trees diseases, that's your cue to maybe take a harder look at it and decide what needs to be done on the tree. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so you've done inspections in your city, but something still happens, right? A branch still falls. So here's an example of a large limb failure. Okay, so you've already done everything you're supposed to do at this point. You've got your grid cycle, you've got inspections going on, but things still happen, right? So here's a large limb failure in a park. You can see a sign in the background that it's near a crosswalk for a school zone. So this is obviously a tree that could potentially have a lot of targets around it, right? Let's go to the next slide and maybe we can see what's going on with that tree. Looks like a large eucalyptus. All right, so on the photo on the left-hand side there, it looks like the tree had a wound at some point. Maybe another branch fell. That's not actually the location where that branch fell from. And it's pointing off to the right-hand side there. So that's a very old wound, and it looks like the tree is trying to heal over it. But that is a source of area where fungi decay can set in the tree and then potentially cause failures in the future. So if you can't decide what's going on with the tree or what you need to do with it from the ground level on just a basic visual inspection like this, then it's time to get up in the tree and see what's going on. So let's look at the next slide. And here you notice we got up in the boom truck. And now we can see that there's two old pruning wounds where those arrows are pointing. And right below that, that's the actual point where the branch fell from. And you can see the white mycelium right there from the fungi that was actually actively decaying the wood. So, you got some either wounds from branches that fell or from pruning wounds. And now decay has set in and was weakening the point of attachment where that one branch was located, and then experienced more load than it could hold at that point, and the branch fell. So how do we assess risk then? If we can't see it from the ground, we have to get up in a boom truck to see these kind of things. So how do we assess this risk and make decisions in our situations? So the ISA has provided different levels of risk assessment, right? And it's all based on their best management practices and also the American National Standards Institute, so ANSI A300. So let's look at the next slide. So not everybody can do a tree risk assessment, right? We really want them to be ISA track qualified, tree risk assessment qualification. So, become qualified, and then it's going to make you more informed to make the decisions that you need. So be proficient with the fundamentals of limited visual and basic tree risk assessment, understand the principles of advanced diagnostic techniques, which we'll discuss here in a bit. You should be able to gather and synthesize that information needed to assess the risk that you're looking at, and then make reasoned judgments for recommendations and doing mitigation on trees. So let's talk about the most simple one here, level 1 limited visual assessment. So it's conducted by a specified perspective ahead of time. So you decide it's going to be a drive-by or it's going to be a walk-by these trees. You're going to identify obvious defects or conditions within the tree with an imminent or probable likelihood of failure. So the risk rating is optional for a level 1. It may not be adequate to provide the mitigation options that you need, but it's at least a starting point. So you're looking at a whole bunch of trees and deciding, what do I need to act upon right away? So this would be something to do in between your grid prune cycles, right? So this would be an inspection and a risk assessment potentially. And look in the photo right there, you can kind of see some Canary Island pine trees that on the right-hand side, they look, pretty decent. Maybe not the form that you want to see, but at least they're green, right? But off to the left-hand side there, those ones don't look quite right. They're kind of yellowing, and you can maybe determine that you don't have to act upon something right away, but that's definitely something that you want to follow up on, because Canary Island pine shouldn't look like that, not that fading yellow color. So that would be a cue to maybe do a level 2 on those particular trees. Let's go to the next slide. So this tree that's laying on the ground is actually one of those trees that you can see in the background of the previous photo that was starting to turn yellow. And what do you see down here in the ground? The roots are pretty much non-existent. It's kind of a pale blue, gray color. Something's kind of odd there in the soil, right? Girdling root potentially. It looks like a root kind of grew out and then wrapped around the tree. So this tree, while it grew for a while, it never had an opportunity, it looks like, to fully develop into the landscape the way it needed, support itself. And it looks like nutrients and water potentially are starting to get choked off, and the storm came, knocked it over. So that would be maybe something you could have caught in a level 2, right? So that would be a detailed visual assessment of its surrounding site, a census of the information that's collected, maybe start digging around the tree, looking for feeder roots, see if there are any. It's basically a ground-based inspection completely around the tree, as opposed to level 1, which is just from one side. So for this, you're spending more time at the tree. You're considering its shape, its surroundings, its health. You're using simple tools such as a diameter tape, binoculars, camera, digging tools, something to give you more information than just the simple walk by or a drive by in a level 1. And then from there, if a level 2 is not enough, then you're going to level 3, the advanced risk assessment. So you're providing additional detailed information specific on one tree or maybe a few trees. And you're starting to use a technology that's not typically used, and not everybody is trained to use it. So to use or perform a level 3 advanced assessment, the controlling authority, you can see in the 4th bullet point there, really needs to consider the value of the tree, because this is a higher level of assessment. It's going to take more time, more money, and it use it for heritage trees, or if you've got a situation with a lot of targets around it, that's where you want to use something like a level 3 assessment. And the next slide will show you an example of what you might get from that. So you can use sonic tomography. That's where you're actually using sensors on the tree. By tapping on the sensors, it's going to record the time that it takes for that tap to travel through the wood of the tree at that level, at that plane where those sensors are located. And from that tomography, you're going to get a read back, which you'll see on the next slide. So the green areas in this sonic tomogram here would indicate where sound actually traveled quickly through the wood, as opposed to the red or kind of pinkish areas where sound took longer. So that would indicate there may be is a defect potentially in the tree where the sound travels slower through voids as opposed to solid substances. So you can see all the different points on the tree. There's 15 different points, each tapped on it, and then you can get a read back like this. So that gives you better information what's going on inside the tree. So now we've talked about the levels of risk assessment. Here's another case study for you to consider. The city's authorized a level 1 risk assessment to update the recommended maintenance in the inventory. This particular oak tree hasn't, its condition hasn't changed since its first inspection 2 years ago. There's an ordinance that says no rocks are supposed to be installed in any tree. So you can see it's kind of the canopy is thinning, something's wrong with the tree. So you can consider performing a level 2 risk assessment on it. You've done a level 1, maybe you want to do a level 2 and see if you can get more information as to what's the problem on the tree. Or maybe you would only crown clean the tree to get the dead wood out and then just keep it on a grid routine trim cycle. Maybe you'd do nothing. Maybe not. The dead branches could make good wildlife habitat area. Perform a level 3. Maybe you're going to start doing some sonic tomography on it, or maybe take some samples to the lab. So there's different options, right? So you have to decide what's best for your situation and your budget level. Let's look at the next slide. So now that you've done your inspections, you've done levels of risk assessments. So now you need to consider how you're going to actually manage what you have and what the information that you have gleaned from those particular situations. The recommended maintenance, once risk is identified, you're going to determine if you need to enhance your inspection cycles. You need to determine if you need to mitigate for a cause of risk that you see, or maybe you end up having to remove the tree. So let's look at the different ways that you can actually manage risk. So the first one would be to enhance your inspection cycle. So look at trees on a more regular basis, or maybe more frequently. So you want to discuss with your arborist tree contractor to determine what's the best course of action based on your budgets. Put tree on an inspection work order list. So you got your inventory and you know how many trees you have, you know their condition. So now use work lists to determine what you're going to see, who's going to see it, and when it's going to happen. Some of those inspections you might determine have to be on the higher level of assessment. You can put high risk trees on a more frequent inspection cycle and track those inspections over time using a calendar reminder. That's a good way to do it. Mitigating the cause of risk. So you've got your information. So what do? Are you going to prune to reduce or modify the canopy in some way? Are you going to cable, brace the tree by adding structural supports? Are you going to consider plant healthcare techniques? These are all valid ways of managing or mitigating risk. So here's an example. So this particular tree was actually transplanted to this location in the size that you see right there. It was moved from one city location to this new park that was developed. So deodar cedar, high community value, it was transplanted to a more suitable site. They retained the tree. So the mitigation to keep it from failing, cabled to ensure structural integrity, and then soil injections were done to potentially, if there are pathogens in the soil that would attack the roots. So there was some fungicides applied to the tree. So I think that's a good situation. But sometimes you have to remove trees, as you can see on the next slide. So not always are you going to be able to preserve trees. So the reasons for tree removal might be because it's dead, diseased, it has poor structure, the targets around it cannot be moved, there's overhead spacing issues, maybe there's tree spacing issues, you have too many in one location, and if you remove a whole bunch, then the others are going to be exposed to wind loading, or maybe they don't even belong there, they're seedling or volunteers. So let's look at the next slide. So no matter what, the responsiveness is the key. So a slow response time is going to mean a greater chance of failure and exposure to damage claim. And you got to consider, how am I going to mitigate the risk? Is it going to be done at the next grid pruning, or do I have to jump on it right away? Are there other defects in the tree that I could mitigate at the same time? So here's our last case study to consider. So a resident's having a party, goes to hang a piñata from the tree and sees this shear plane crack in a Chinese elm branch. So what are you going to do, right? So you could consider different things. Maybe go up in the tree with a boom truck, aerial inspection of the crack and support system. It's kind of hard to see, but on the left-hand side of the image right there, there's actually a brace in between those two branches right there. I think it's maybe a rod. I can't remember exactly what they used, but there is actually support right there in between those two branches. So maybe you call out an emergency crew for immediate limb removal because you're concerned that the branch is going to fall. You're going to caution tape. You're going to tell them not to have their party right there. So you got to decide on what's the best course of action, and you have to have the experience and qualifications to make those decisions. Next slide. So the California JPIA, that's Joint Powers Insurance Authority, it's a good resource for developing inspection and maintenance policy within your different jurisdictions and agencies. So the insurance authority's effort is basically, with this document, is to reduce tree exposure and liability. There are guidelines and procedures for the maintenance of trees in order to maximize their benefits. So it tells you on a guideline what you should do and when you should do it. It's basically, it really is a guideline. It's not meant to be copied and pasted directly right into your ordinances or policies, but it's meant to get you in the right direction of what's going to be best for your city. So we here at West Coast Arborists and a lot of cities recommend this particular document. All right, so we've talked about inspections, we've talked about the risk levels, we've talked about mitigating those kind of risks. So Scott's going to talk about how do you actually put that into practice within your city. And I hope this has been an insightful presentation for you all.
All right, thank you so much, Tim.
You're
it's
welcome.
great to be here with everyone, and just want to recognize a couple other folks on our team, Mark Standriff, our director of the Beautify Fresno initiative, and also Miguel Ramirez from my department, who's our community coordinator and very active in the tree and landscape program. So next slide. All right, as Tim mentioned, now we're going to look into more of a municipal perspective on tree maintenance work types to prevent risk. And that ranges from very much up front, the right tree at the right place, meaning we're properly selecting trees. Even if a particular developer wants to plant this very large tree in a 2-foot wide park strip, not a good idea. Or a homeowner, what they want to plant. Down to talking about pruning method, and then a geobase type of routine grid trim cycle. Next slide. Okay, so starting off, the right tree in the right place. We can avoid a lot of problems down the road with really careful selection. And it's tough to be the one to say no. We want to get to yes and steer people in the right direction. But considerations, of course, what is that future growth, height and shape? Maybe a tree looks really great for the first few years. Maybe it grows rapidly, fills the space, but what will it look like long term? We have to look up overhead. We have to keep our partners at PG&E, AT&T, other agencies in mind, and especially the tree. Climate conditions, what type of situation, what watering, what irrigation do we have available? What other plant material goes around that tree? Also, urban forest diversity is a key consideration. We often love to select a certain tree type to be on a certain corridor, or maybe we like it many places, but does that give us the diversity we need for the health of the urban forest? And of course, underground. I wanted to touch on about a decade ago, PG&E went through a really big effort to mitigate their risk and had identified quite a number of trees planted over locations with underground gas mains and other facilities close by. So we have to partner again with other agencies, whether that's large irrigation district pipelines, sewer, water, gas mains, all very important. So talking about pruning, and this is something I think we can really help in your respective roles to educate both the public and elected officials, directors, decision makers about that. There's no one size fits all. As Tim had shared about earlier, in some cases, it may be a need for a more structural pruning, especially for young trees to get that strong central leader, set them on a good path for success in the life of that tree. Crown cleaning is also key for the health of that tree, removing dead, diseased, detached, broken branches. We, of course, don't want to prune any live foliage during that process. And this is not for young trees, but this is more for the mature trees. And we saw some photos of that earlier. Crown thinning is often something the community likes to see, opening up that canopy. And of course, we want to be very, very careful with that, and no more than 25% of that live foliage being removed in a particular growing season. Raising the crown, vertical clearance in our world as cities, this is often very critical. We have other users for the street. We have needs of the solid waste trucks getting in to be able to do pickups. We have a need, community wants to see the streets be swept. And so a street sweeper has that vertical clearance to get under the tree canopy. Of course, crown restoration, reduction, utility pruning, as you can see here, these are other methods. And again, it's getting that expertise, having the right people look at the trees, look at the urban forest, and select a proper method for that best health. Next slide. All right, so focusing on the first one, structural pruning. Again, we have younger trees here, had not been planted too long, and setting them on a path for success. Things we look for, as you can see here, single central stem, adequate branch spacing, and thinking ahead, where will those branches go in the future? Especially if we're not going to be back for a trim cycle for a number of years. Promoting strong branch attachments. You want good distribution of the foliage. And what does this do long term? We want to see, as a city, we want to see, of course, a reduced number of tree failures. We want lower long-term costs. If we can correct it up front, that's a very low-cost solution. That's just a win-win for everyone. And Mona, next slide. All right. Here's one just for city of Fresno in particular. Really our goal, we are not there yet, but is to achieve a 7-year trim cycle. And I want to show you from our own electronic asset management system. These are what we call geobases, the half-mile grids. And this particular slide shows a color coding of when we performed that complete grid trim of all the trees in the neighborhood. And you know, we talked a little bit about that. You want to promote the health of that whole urban forest. So it may be only 2 people in that neighborhood had tree complaints or were complaining, but their trees are most likely in very similar situations to many in that same neighborhood. So rather than just going in with a one-off, let's trim Mrs. Jones' tree on this corner, we really want to schedule that complete geobase trim of the neighborhood. So color coded, you can see by year, and we really don't like seeing these neighborhoods here that have not had a geobase trim in the gray. And then there are those that are the white color that have not had any in the past 19 years. So we're really trying to promote that. Next slide. Okay, so what does that consist of for that grid, that routine trim cycle? We want to reduce the need for emergency maintenance. It's much cheaper, of course, to go through, more kind of like an assembly line, go through and address the needs of your street tree inventory in that full neighborhood, that full geobase, rather than having to respond in the middle of the night or Saturday, Sunday premium time, and also dealing with damage to either public or private property. So these are composed of a pre-designed trim grid, depending upon the street layout, the nature of the neighborhoods, what that grid looks like for your community may be a little different. Fresno has a great classic half-mile grid system, and that lends itself very well to our geobases of the half-mile by half-mile grids. Within that, again, we're looking to help prevent liability problems down the road. We'll talk a little more about our heat maps and what we've seen. And again, not just to reduce future liability and risk, but also to promote that urban forest health and real value. And we'll talk about a little more later. Next slide. Okay, so what kind of benefits do we have? Number one is really about economy of scale, this long-term grid schedule. It's about efficiency, use of personnel and resources. From a public relations standpoint, both for citizens and our elected officials. Maybe that particular council member or it's a supervisor in the county system, maybe they're getting phone calls and they say, get out there right away, we want to get this done. This information is helpful to be able to say, you know, we were there 2 years ago. And council member or supervisor within your district, we have this other neighborhood, and we haven't been there for 15 years. Look at this. That's real data that can help you in managing your urban forest. And it helps with the citizens as well. We talked about that complete neighborhood treatment and addressing all the needs in that area so that they're receiving services, not just because they've called, but because it's really the best care for that area and benefits. And from a preventive maintenance standpoint, again, minimizing risk, we want to address that when it's a $200 effort, not when it's a $2,000, $20,000 effort at crisis level. And we can go to the next slide. All right. We also talk about improving health of the tree, the grid pruning through just, again, routine effort, things like removing the dead wood, correcting the structure. And what people always comment to me and we hear from our city council offices is the big enhancement in appearance of the neighborhood, that reinvestment. We need to capital asset. We need to really think of our urban forest as a tremendous capital asset for the community. And again, it can be often overlooked or taken for granted. We've talked about reduced liability. Again, and these are helpful talking points, I hope, for you in promoting really why we want to invest in the urban forest. All trees are serviced in a timely manner and reducing that liability exposure. Record keeping is the last thing I want to stress about that routine trim cycle, that we're able to update the tree characteristic information. Once you have an urban forest tree inventory complete, that's only as good as your effort to maintain it. And so record keeping provides a great system to note what type of trimming we've done, what time occurred, and we can even look, that may be of help to you in future litigation if you do have a case or risk claim. Next slide. Okay, so talking about needs and prioritizations, of course, as a public works director, repaving and taking care of our streets is always important. But I really want to stress, how far the dollars can go for different assets. So we talked about a, quarter square mile, half mile by half mile area. And say it's one that has street trees throughout the neighborhood and the park strip. depending upon the type of tree, whether, you know, how tall are these, what kind of diameter, tree trimming of that geobase, that could range anywhere from $20,000 to upwards of $80,000 for that investment. And you touch the full neighborhood, really every property owner, every homeowner gets to see that. Conversely, if the streets are in failed condition, that can cost upwards of about $1.6 million to repave. Tremendous need, but you know, sometimes, for example, with our Fresno City Council, they've opted to vote for some discretionary money by district. And if a council member has, say, I have $100,000 to spend, what can I do for some of these neighborhoods? Repaving is out of sight. That's not really an option. We may be able to do some concrete repair, but something that I regularly pitch and advocate for is really, hey, here are some neighborhoods that need a full geobase trim for that area. Next slide. Okay, so overall, again, we've talked about risk management, and this is kind of just a great, either an upward spiral, a great feedback loop of building up a community, or conversely, if neglected, I think it can really be a downward spiral. We talk about reducing risk, better management of the urban forest, really greater benefits. We'll talk about what are some of those, and then leveraging funding. And of course, those are all great things, rather than seeing expensive risk claims, loss of this asset to the community, and seeing, you know, property values decline and not seeing return on investment. Next slide. Okay, so overall forest health. Again, this is just summarizing a lot of the things that Tim covered earlier, but that's all about inspections, mitigations, sometimes removals. Trees do not live forever. They do have a life, and we need to prepare for those removals and replanting. So how do we do that? This takes some work, but these are things like policy documents that may be a resolution, may be adopted by resolution of your city council or your board of supervisors. Policies and procedures at the department level. Maybe it's in your municipal code, meaning through an ordinance. Perhaps the advisory body, the legislative body, adopts an urban forest management plan, selected group of street trees, and a tree maintenance manual. These all take planning and work up front, but with big payoffs in the long run. Next slide. All right, so for City of Fresno, just wanted to touch on what does this look like, what opportunities are out there. We were able to receive a CAL FIRE grant to do an urban forest inventory. We found plenty of trees that had been planted without permits and were not in our database. So that's been really good information. Inventoried over 140,000 trees in public rights of way. Now moving on from just this inventory to a follow-up grant, an urban forest management plan. We are preparing an RFQ, plan to bring a firm on board to conduct that work. And again, so now that you have the data, what are you going to do with it? How do you best utilize that for a management plan that can really guide public investment? Next slide. Okay, so again, to recap, what kinds of benefits are out there? Again, it's a growing asset, no pun intended here. We find that neighborhoods that have a really mature tree canopy, those beautiful residential streets, tend to command higher property values. Conversely, those where trees have all been removed, cut down, maybe it was deemed either too much maintenance, too much headache for the property owners. Those properties, those residential neighborhoods often, unfortunately, tend to decline in value. Also, tree canopy, this urban forest achieves city goals, such as maybe your municipality has a climate action plan. Maybe you're looking to reduce greenhouse gases. Trees are a wonderful, wonderful return on investment, have a great cost-benefit ratio for those efforts. Also for conservation, environmental justice, having canopy cover goals, being pedestrian friendly, and even bike friendly for the community. Those of us who enjoy the trails or using bike lanes, you can appreciate how much more pleasurable that is to bike, or run, walk down a tree-lined corridor. Next slide. All right, we've talked about limited funding. So I did want to touch on something that's been very successful for us as the city of Fresno, and that is simply recognizing limited needs. And now new development comes along. People may ask, wow, how is it that new neighborhoods seem to be so much better cared for than older neighborhoods? And that is principally because of community facilities districts. The acronym is CFD. In the city of Fresno, we give developers a choice, either to form a homeowners association or to annex the new public facilities into the CFD. What those are, it's a special tax. In addition to regular property taxes, it's firewalled and can only be used for the purpose collected within that neighborhood. And what we do, we include things like street lighting, pocket parks, the landscape buffer around the neighborhood. But importantly, for trees, any street trees or buffer trees, or even median island trees that are part of that CFD that are installed by the developer, go into that district. And there's funding in the district, not only for just a 30-day landscape maintenance period, to clean minor pruning, but also future for trees for tree trimming, ultimate tree replacement, irrigation system replacement, because we recognize we do not have the financial resources to take those on without the CFD. Next slide. All right, as we've shared, it's a great investment. Trees pay us back. An example of 100 trees over 40 years, cost of $101,000, and benefits. Again, there are formulas out here, there are metrics available. I know Tree Fresno has many of these metrics and studies available if you're interested in follow-up information on this, but there's no doubt huge benefits and a big payoff for trees. Next slide. All right, measuring tree value. There are plenty of resources out there. Again, these are great tools to help make the case and argue for the investments needing to be made. The ISA guide for plant appraisal, which includes a cost approach. There's an income approach to measuring value of trees. Sales comparison. What would it cost you to go out and replace one of this size? What is the replacement value and also property value? Next slide. Again, here's an example of just showing how you can tabulate those. This is from a case study. And again, back to, you cannot do this without a good tree inventory. So that's really a first step, funding a tree inventory, getting it in place to what do you have in the inventory? What species, how many, and what is the value of that? And I think you'll find if you track that return on investment over time with budget and value assessment, that's a value that will just continue to grow. Next slide. All right. So in terms of prioritizing needs and also making the case for investment in trees, I would encourage just working effectively with maybe community organizations. There may be neighborhood groups, tree boards, or residences that you have. And again, each year we know how there are competing priorities and limited resources out there. So these again can help make the case for that continued ongoing investment. Groups and your local nonprofits, they can act as community liaisons help understand the community needs, and really even from a city perspective, help augment your own resources. Cities often have a tough time really getting out to hear all the needs of all the various neighborhoods, and there are some wonderful volunteers who you can partner with in these ways. Also providing opportunities for public review and comment will of course reduce conflict and getting negative input later when folks are left in the dark. Next slide. All right. One of the ways that we also do that, in addition to a more formal meeting, neighborhood outreach standpoint, is Fresno. We let everyone through, using their phones, smartphones or 311 call center to really communicate needs. We have over 30,000 residents who've downloaded the app. And again, thousands more. We do have a phone service for those of us more old school who would prefer to call by phone. But services, of course, range from graffiti, potholes, weeds in the median island, you name it. But trees have been incredibly high percentage of that program of the Fresno calls since that app was initiated. Over 18,000 service requests, and that ranges from everything from tree interfering, blocking, fallen limb, just requesting an inspection. Someone may have concerns about a tree that's over their driveway or over where they park their cars. Obstruction of use, someone who actually wants to, is concerned of a diseased tree. All of those come in through Fresno, and we're able with that even to generate heat maps of those calls. Next slide. All right, so with those service requests so far this year, just 362 calls, but those have been keeping us extremely busy. We're able to map out, as shown on this map, where are greater concentrations. And I didn't have a slide on it, but if we were to zoom into a particular neighborhood, you'd see lots of red dots. Those really guide investments. If we're getting a lot of red dots, a lot of calls, that's meaning a lot of reactive time and dollars spent on something that ideally could have been avoided. So that guides us toward neighborhoods that we'd recommend for those geo-based trim cycles as we work to increase what our cycles are. Next slide. Okay, and getting close to the end here. This is a couple case studies for you. One from Encinitas. Here's where we had some changes motivated both by the community and a very active city council regarding trees. Formally developed an urban forest subcommittee. An effort was spent in modifying and updating their policies, as we talked about earlier. I'm very jealous here. They're able to get their trim cycle to a 3-year period. By the way, I once, about a decade ago, worked for a city manager here in Fresno who had previously been city manager in Beverly Hills and said, Scott, I think in Beverly Hills, we had an annual trim cycle. Anyway, love to get there. And Encinitas, they also develop protocols, very important for planning, removal, PHC, and sidewalk route management, all very key. Next slide. Okay, this is a tough one that we hope and pray never happens, but case from city of San Diego with palm trees. You may have heard of this. A man was crushed when a palm tree in the public right-of-way toppled over, and the lawsuit was filed against the city. Of course, the claim came in that the city was liable, that it underfunded the tree program, and this was in place for decades to inspect and maintain trees in the public right-of-way. In spite of the city, of course, opposing that claim, the verdict was handed down in favor of the individual, this man, following a 3-week trial in Superior Court. You can imagine what the city of San Diego spent on that trial as well. Jury verdict, $7.6 million against the agency. Trim cycle would be $800,000. So that's another point just in managing risk. There's a financial aspect of it to each agency. All right, next slide. Okay, that concludes my portion. So I think, Mona, we're back to some Q&A.
Sure. Okay. We do have a couple of moments for a couple of questions, and we'll start with what's the correct way to report dead trees between trees and sidewalks? Is it to go through Fresno, or what is the best way to communicate with the city about such trees? Scott. Sorry about that.
Oh, sorry, Mona. I was thinking Tim was grabbing that one. Can you read?
Oh, sure. So reporting to, for instance, the city of Fresno, because you mentioned Fresgo, the app, and that's been a very reliable means for the community to communicate with the city of Fresno. Is that the most appropriate way to report dead trees between streets and sidewalks, or do you recommend a different route?
Of course, it depends upon if it's an emergency issue or non-emergency basis. If it's emergency, certainly a call to 311 is recommended. But for non-emergency, yes, Fresno gets it immediately to dispatch in our landscape division in the tree program, and we can respond accordingly.
Okay, and I'll also have you answer this next question, and it's basically balancing the request of citizens again for the scheduled grid cycle. So say a resident wants a tree trimmed now, but it's not scheduled for another 6 years. Is that again the sort of their by request and priority according to the city?
It is. Again, we definitely, as the city of Fresno, we look at emergency needs. And if there is, for example, a limb which appears unhealthy, potential risk, that's something where we do have 3 reactive 2-person tree crews who could respond to that. But if we're really talking about either a more things like, crown thinning and dealing with like clearance trims and a combination thereof, that's something where the cost, we really don't want to go in and just address one, because addressing that one concern in a neighborhood will likely generate about another 15 to 16 calls from others who say, wait, why did you show up to trim this one tree? All of ours are similar. Why did, we loved seeing you show up, but why did you stop? So we do work with our electeds, our city council members, and there may be some discretionary funding under the council members' control where they'd opt to expedite, move up that entire neighborhood as a priority.
Okay, that's good to know. And then one last question before we move on to CAL FIRE. How and within what section would the urban tree assessment and recommendations be located within your general plan, with the city's general plan? So it's urban tree assessment and recommendations. Where is that found? Do we know?
I would need to follow up on that one in terms of the general plan. I know there are goals and policies in the general plan related to the urban forest that do promote best practices. But if the person asking the question wanted to follow up with me, we can certainly, as a city, provide more information on that.
Okay, and here at Tree Fresno, we're happy to take those questions, and we communicate with the city regularly. So you can email Mona at treefresno.org, and we can attend to that, follow up that question. So thank you, Scott. I appreciate that very much, and thank you, Tim. We're going to move on to the next section, and that is with Greg Dion at CAL FIRE. So he's the San Joaquin Regional Urban Forester for CAL FIRE's Urban and Community Forestry Program. He provides expert urban forestry support to communities, nonprofits like Tree Fresno, and other municipal governments to create and maintain sustainable urban forests. Greg also administers and provides technical support for grant-related activities such as tree planting, municipal tree inventories and management plans, urban forest educational efforts, and innovative urban forestry projects, primarily located in the San Joaquin Valley and the Central Coast. He has a Bachelor's of Science degree in forestry with a concentration in natural resource conservation from Humboldt State. And he started serving the Central Valley and Central Coast in August of 2017. Prior to that role, Greg held positions in the United States Forest Service as a recreation technician, serving San Bernardino's off-highway vehicle program, and as a forestry technician, preparing timber sales in the Lassen National Forest. He's currently studying to obtain his registered professional forester's license and plans to sit on the 2021 October exam. So thank you, Greg, for joining us today. And can you tell us a little bit about what CAL FIRE is up to?
Thank you, Mona. And I just want to start off by saying good morning to everybody, and also thank you for being in attendance and taking the time to have interest in your urban forest. In the last 5 years, I've seen this industry grow with leaps and bounds as far as the interest goes from everybody. So I just want to say thank you for being a part of that growth. And if you go to the next slide, Mona. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a background of CAL FIRE's Urban and Community Forestry Grant Program. We work under the authority of the Urban Forestry Act of 1978. It was updated in 2017, and it's under the California Public Resource Code, and those sections are there for you. And that'll outline about what we can do, what we can't do in CAL FIRE's Urban and Community Forestry Program. And so I'm going to jump down a little bit over here, just give you a little background. Over the last 4 to 6 years, CAL FIRE has received $20 million a year for our grantees. And we've planted about 80,000 trees since 2014 in California. Now that's an understatement a little bit, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But in the Central Valley alone, we've planted 15,000 trees. So it's a tremendous, tremendous growth in our urban canopy forest, our urban forest canopy, sorry. And we're very proud to have all the partnerships that we have with this. And so right now, a significant amount of funding is in the governor's proposed budget, waiting legislative approval. And it's been talked about $75 million for the Urban Forestry Community Grant Program. Of course, we would split this over multiple years, but that means that new grant rounds are coming out. So the 21-22 grant round is kind of up in the air, depends on when we're going to get that funding, if it's enough time to allow our prospective grantees to have a good proposal amount of time to get a competitive concept proposal in for us and application. So the program funding for this new round comes from CCI funding, but this is kind of the nutshell guidelines of what we require for all our grant projects. They must sequester a significant amount of greenhouse gases and or avoid emissions over the next 40-year period. So, and they have to be a significant amount for the amount of funding that we give. Grant projects are focused on serving disadvantaged communities primarily. About 80% of our funding has to be spent in a DAC or low income status, but mostly in the DAC. And this can be determined using the Cal EnviroScreen 3.0 tool. If you just Google Cal EnviroScreen 3.0, it'll give you a map, and that shows if your area is in the DAC or low income community, which would qualify you for one of our grants. The grant projects must be in an urban area or urban cluster defined by the US Census Bureau, and must be a city, county, district, 501c3, nonprofit, and those are all eligible. So no other types of organizations may apply, unfortunately, except those listed above. Project types include urban forestry, expansion and improvement, which this is just a tree planting grant that any of these organizations can apply for. But the management activities for cities and counties and districts those can only be applied by those local entities. And urban wood and biomass utilization can be applied by all as well. So, but regardless, all grant projects must have a tree planting component. So that pretty much covers my grant opportunities for the next year and going forward. So like I said, upon approval of funding, and if we have enough time to get a competitive grant application timeline out there, we will be posting our grant guidelines and concept proposal applications on our website, and our website is listed here. And also some new news. We now have a CAL FIRE Urban and Community Forestry newsletter. We have a link here, and it's updated every few months when new opportunities or new news comes through. And then we also have my email up here for everybody. And if you have any questions regarding grants or some city tree questions in general, shoot me an email at this email right here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate that very much. And we'll be looking forward to the next round of grants. We love our tree planting activities, and I know the city of Fresno and many of the cities in the Valley do as well. So I want to go ahead and so that we can stay on track, I'd like to introduce John Valentino, who is a co-founder of Tree Fresno from way back in 1985. I've asked him to take a few minutes to talk about the history of Tree Fresno and some of the highlights. And let me tell you just about him briefly before he begins. John is the president owner of John and Bob's Corporation, Truxell and Valentino Landscape Development, Inc., and Sierra Madre Nursery. After earning an AB in landscape architecture from UC Berkeley, John's worked for over 40 years as a landscape contractor, nurseryman, general engineering contractor, and landscape architect. His projects take him all over California and include public works, commercial, and residential. John considers his career not so much as a work as a welcome opportunity to improve everyday lives by creating special places with an emphasis on health and productivity. He's a fan of his local community, and his commitment to Tree Fresno began as a co-founder in 1985 all the way until today. So thank you, John, for presenting on behalf of Tree Fresno. You need to unmute, John.
See, okay,
Yeah.
Thank you, Mona. So I enjoyed Tim, Scott, and Greg's very crisp, modern images, but mine are going to be a little different. I'm going to try to take us all back to the history of Tree Fresno and back to when we started the organization. So hopefully I can put you in our shoes as we considered these original documents, which look like maybe they're even older than that, but their origins are from 1984 and 1985. In 1984, Fresno was rated as the least livable city in America by the Places Rated Almanac. And because of that dubious distinction, the mayor of Fresno was invited to go on the David Letterman show. And he decided, instead of arguing and huffing and puffing about the unfairness of such a designation, that he would use humor. And when Letterman asked him what the redeeming qualities of Fresno were, he said, on a hot summer day, it rarely gets over 120 degrees. And then he doubled down on that and he said, Dave, you know, more people would leave Fresno if they could, but they can't because their shoes are stuck in the asphalt. And as our small group of kind of local rabble rousers considered the mayor trying to poke fun at one of Fresno's genuine problems, which is heat in the summer, we considered these images that you're looking at now, where, you know, it's difficult to lower temperatures in an urban environment. And usually with urban amenities, those temperatures increase. And yet we have these living wonders of nature that can do what we show here. If you have a 95-degree day, the prior image showed that it would be 120 degrees at the base of a building because of reflected heat. And then that one right there. And then if you add a broad spreading deciduous tree, you're at 90 degrees. And so this is what really was the beginning of us saying we should figure out a way to fund cooling Fresno on a widespread basis with an urban tree canopy. And if we're successful in doing that at all, the implications of that are major. We not only make it more comfortable for people to conduct their everyday lives, but issues like ozone, which are directly related to heat, ozone layer amounts, percentages go up dramatically in the summer because of the rise in temperature. And how do we reverse that? An urban tree canopy is not only an effective way to reduce it, but one that impacts all kinds of other issues at the same time. At the time, we liked to call this cities are for people. And we envisioned cooling Fresno like you would cool this outdoor space. And we talked about the fact that, you know, there's a lot of studies and a lot of effort that goes into looking at how you impact poverty and crime and unemployment, all challenges in Fresno over the years. But the most practical way that we felt we could do it is you make it a better place to live. You make it a place where your shoes don't get stuck in the asphalt and where people want to invest in because it's comfortable. Hopefully it's relatively cool or tolerable in the summer. And so this image became kind of cities are for people. And really one of the main hallmarks of Tree Fresno is trying to improve Fresno by making all of our everyday lives better. And so with that kind of background of realizing that we can actually improve the outdoor environment in Fresno and the opportunity of a centennial celebration in 1985 in Fresno, we formed Tree Fresno. And our first projects in Tree Fresno were all organized around individual neighborhoods and streets that had an absence of street trees and an abundance of enthusiastic people that wanted to contribute a little money and get together and plant trees on the weekend. This is one of those streets that this one was planted in about 1990 and 91 and has Chinese hackberry. You can envision it without, I mean, it's really transformed that street into a much more attractive shady street. And so the first few years, Tree Fresno really focused on these types of neighborhood plantings where neighbors got together, shared food, and planted trees, kind of a great formula for building neighborhood. In addition to those neighborhood plantings, we immediately tried, wherever possible, to advocate. We always spoke about, and continue to this day, that it's not only about planting trees, but about having places to plant trees. And so we advocated for, in this case, Olive Avenue in the Tower District, a median island where we could plant trees, and that would fundamentally change the look of that street. These are Zelkovas, one of Tree Fresno's early projects, where we advocated for the creation of that median island, and then we planted the trees with volunteers back in probably the late 80s. Lots of our projects now, since we started the organization in 1985, are really substantive and provide sizable trees. These are southern live oaks in a neighborhood planted on the median island, which was bare before we did this planting in the late 80s. These were recently pruned by West Coast arborists. They're really making that street a special place with an identity. The southern live oak in that case was, on the prior slide, was unusual because it's an evergreen tree. Normally, we were focused on planting broad spreading deciduous trees in order to cool the city in the summer and let in light in the winter. This was an exception. Most of the times the tree selections were based on conferring with the city of Fresno. I'm not sure what went into that one, that selection, but it's making Weldon Avenue there look special. Recently, those are some of the historical projects. And then recently we've done some nice plantings. You can see the recently staked trees here. This is at the Fresno City College campus. At the same time, we did, around the same time, we did a substantial planting at Fresno State College. And both of those were involving quite a number of trees at Fresno State, over 300. And so those campus trees and all the trees that we've planted since 1985 have brought our tally to about 50,000 trees planted since the inception of the organization. While we have measurable and distinct benefits of tree planting in urban areas that can be cited, such as the temperature reduction that we looked at earlier, and air quality, particulate trapping, and all the things that trees do, I think one of the things we've touted from the beginning that's probably the most effective, and that I talk about every time I talk about the benefits of trees, is to look at the wonder of trees. And in California, we have the advantage of being able to experience some of the most wondrous trees, the tallest living thing on earth, the coast redwood, the state tree of California, the biggest living thing on earth, which is the giant sequoia in the Sierra Nevadas. The coast redwood grows along the coast from Santa Cruz northward in a native situation, only place in the world that does that. And then another wondrous tree, the bristlecone pine, the oldest living thing on earth. And that, I think, is the next image. And barely looks alive, but Methuselah here has been named as being the oldest living thing on earth. And it is alive at somewhere around 5,000 years old. So the whole idea of Tree Fresno and other of our sister organizations that I hope are watching in is to tap into that wonder and allow it to impact our urban areas by making it somewhere where your shoes won't get stuck in the asphalt, and where you can be comfortable, where you can create communities that people want to invest in, hence impacting the livability and the prosperity of communities. That's what Tree Fresno is all about, and that's what our history is all about.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that on behalf of Tree Fresno. And thank you all for joining us today. A special thanks to the California Urban Forest Council, Scott Mosier and his team at the City of Fresno, West Coast Arborists, CAL FIRE, and Tree Fresno. And we look forward to hosting other webinars in the future. Please take down this information if you'd like to have CEUs for the session, and you're welcome to contact me at Tree Fresno or the other email on the screen at West Coast Arborists. Have a great day.